Good afternoon, Regenstrief community. I'm gonna go ahead and get us started because that way we should have some time for Q&A at the end. But I am delighted to introduce today's Sam Regenstrief Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Lipika Samal. Dr. Samal is, I can't think of anyone better to give this kind of lecture. She's works at the intersection of health services research and biomedical informatics at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. She's an associate professor of medicine there. And a lot of her work, both her K23 and K01, or R01, sorry, R01, K first, then the R. That's right, that's the series, has focused around chronic kidney disease and using clinical decision support technologies to improve care for that population, and plus a multitude of other projects. So even though it took some convincing for her to do a research career, she's excelled at it. And so we are just more than pleased that she accepted our invitation to come and talk with us today about her work. And so without any further ado, please help me to welcome Dr. Samal to Regenstrief.
Thank you. This is actually, can you guys hear me? I have this little lapel thing here. If I just speak normally, can you hear me? Oh, cool. Okay. You guys are high tech. So this is actually my second visit. I came in 2010 when I was on the interview circuit, and everything looks different and this building's beautiful. So it's really nice to be here again. And I've met a bunch of great folks already. Hopefully I'll meet more of you in the session after this. So this presentation covers kind of a lot of material. I actually attempted to summarize my K-word project and how that led into the R01, which was a pragmatic clinical trial of CDS for patients with CKD, chronic kidney disease, and uncontrolled hypertension. This is the I have no disclosures slide. This is funded by NDDK. All right, so I know we have a real cross-section of clinical and other disciplines here. Oh, sorry, this is my background slide. Let me say that first. So I did a general internal medicine research fellowship at Hopkins, and then I've been practicing primary care at Brigham and Women's since 2010. I co-direct our GIM research fellowship, and I'm also the medical director of research for our practice-based research network. I just recently took on a role with our EPIC group as lead for research that just started September 1st, so still learning what that means. And my interests are wide-ranging. I chose chronic kidney disease as just to focus for a funding perspective, but I'm also very interested in all the other chronic diseases and also care coordination, population health, transitions of care. I didn't have it up here, patient-facing technology as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of the chronic kidney disease background, hopefully to level set for those who are not clinical, and a little bit of what I did early on in my junior faculty position with our EHR data, looking at the practice patterns within our primary care. We have 15 primary care practices. Talk about what the K-word project was, what we set out to do there. We did use we did use CCDA to extract data from our old EHR. And I know a lot of folks here are experts in that, so I put a little bit of detail in about that. Lessons learned that led into the R01 project. And I can just look over there. This is so much better. And then a little bit about our iterative approach to CDS development, including some user-centered design, computable phenotypes from EHR data, a little bit of detail about this adverse clinical outcomes monitoring that we decided to do as the clinical trial, the pragmatic clinical trial was running on its own, and some of the outcomes from the study. It was actually published in JAMA Internal Medicine a couple months ago. So clinical decision support for chronic kidney disease. So chronic kidney disease is very highly prevalent, but majority of people are in very early stages of disease, asymptomatic. About, the estimates are around like 20, maybe closer to 30 million now for chronic kidney disease. About 500,000 are in end-stage disease, on dialysis, or have transplants. Once someone progresses to end-stage disease, if they are, especially on in-center hemodialysis, the mortality rates are pretty bad still. About 50% survive more than 3 years, and that's usually from cardiovascular events. It's very tough on your body to do in-center hemodialysis. So people sometimes say where we are now with CKD is where we were with hypertension in the 1970s. There's new evidence around slowing or preventing end-stage kidney disease. We know that the level of protein in the urine is a very important prognostic biomarker, you could call it, or indicator. And so that is something that is not really been taken up in primary care, but it's very important. And we want to add that information in with our decision making to the blood test, serum creatinine. And we know that CKD is a significant risk factor for cardiovascular mortality. That's actually, like as I was saying, one of the main causes of death. So some of the things that have been found out over the past 20 years, but not completely taken up in practice yet, blood pressure control delays progression. So there's diabetic kidney disease and non-diabetic kidney disease. And in both cases, blood pressure control, very important. There are certain types of medicines, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, that confer other benefits beyond just blood pressure control. And referral to nephrology specialists, just to be prepared for either transplant, which is preferable, or dialysis through an AV fistula rather than a catheter. These are the ways that we have cost, morbidity, mortality benefits of early referral. And that's been shown in the VA, like even just a few months before someone starts dialysis, to have impacts that are quite positive. But referrals often late in the course of progression. And that was the area that I was most interested in when I started writing my K award. First, we did some work looking at our own patients. At the time, we found about 3,100 patients who had stage 3 or 4 CKD, which is still considered early stage. Stage 4 is starting to move toward where you're thinking about kidney failure. So we found that in our own primary care practices, only about 40% had this urine protein test, which is very important prognostic indicator. ACE ARB prescription around 65%. You can see the mean blood pressure, systolic and diastolic there wasn't too bad at the time. The goal, like the guidelines said 140/90, or for diabetes 130/80. So we weren't too far off there. And I was using like the 140/90 as our benchmark, 71%, not benchmark, threshold. 11% had seen nephrology in the previous year. And then if you just look at stage 4, which is really more where nephrology referrals indicated, less than half. So this data, we collected it actually as part of a project with my friend Adam Wright, he's very interested in the problem list, and he did a whole suite of projects around trying to improve documentation of diagnoses on the problem lists. And so we did a whole analysis looking at whether or not problem list documentation was correlated with better outcomes. And we did find, for some things it was, a lot of things it wasn't. What was interesting is when we submitted it, the reviewers, of course, nephrologists were like, but we don't care about that. Tell us who was seeing a nephrologist. And so we did this other analysis. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is kind of like the table 1, comparing patients who had or had not seen a nephrologist in the previous year, just to kind of see. So this is just the characteristics of the patients. There were some significant difference in terms of different factors as to who was seeing a nephrologist versus not. The third from the bottom is like the number of PCP visits in the previous year. So you can see people that were seeing PCPs more frequently, more likely to have nephrology co-management. And so then what we found when we looked at some of these outcome or like process measures, so having had the blood test to calculate the estimated glomerular filtration rate or EGFR, little bit of a difference there, but numbers were like 95%. Urine protein testing, huge difference. And then whether or not they were on an ACE or ARB, what their systolic mean blood pressure was, and blood pressure control, actually not that different. So, so to me, that was kind of interesting because, one of the things that I was really thinking about with the K award was we want to get patients to the nephrologist, but then the PCPs are saying, like, what are they going to do differently? And so it was really an important thing to look at all this data and be able to say, well, like, for one thing, they're going to get them on the ACE inhibitor, or they're going to, sorry, not get them ACE inhibitor, they're going to check the urine protein, and there's a number of other laboratory tests that, especially in stage 3, PCPs weren't checking. But it was good to kind of make myself be aware of the fact that there are really important metrics were not that different. So this was something that came out around the time that I was writing the K award. I like it because it's a heat map and people just kind of like it makes it feel like easier to understand. So if you look at the rows, as you go down, you're going from normal glomerular filtration rate, or like the blood tests showing how the kidney's functioning. As you go down, you go to like worse and worse function. But as you go across the columns, you're seeing higher levels of urine protein. And the ACR stands for albumin to creatinine ratio. So you can see that even with fairly normal blood tests, you can have a significantly higher risk of kidney failure with higher levels of protein. And this was something that came out in the guidelines that are from the nephrology specialty groups, but it really did not percolate through primary care. I'd say even now it has not totally percolated through primary care. We still have huge gaps in terms of monitoring the ACR. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about. And then the other thing is just, listening to my PCP colleagues and how they think about whether to make the decision to refer or not. They're always struggling with thoughts like, well, they're not going to do that much different stuff. I can learn how to do that stuff. if this is a person doesn't look like they're really going to progress to kidney failure, I really don't want to take up the nephrologist's time. So trying to guess who's going to progress, it's not well correlated with the staging system, not linear. In one study, like half of the patients had nonlinear progression. Another study, like 2/3 would kind of be going down like this, and then it'd be like 1/6 something like that. And there's actually been a ton more work on this, looking at all different types of trajectories of changes in kidney function. So it's pretty complicated. It's not, I think the old way of thinking about it is like, it just goes like this, and at some point you should like refer. So just around the time I was writing the K-word proposal, this paper was published in JAMA. And this was from a group in Canada. It was really a nephrology referral population, but large numbers of patients, linear regression model, tested a bunch of different models, explained why they chose this 8-variable model, which is based on demographics and blood and urine tests. And so this was kind of great timing for me because I'm not really in the model development business, but here's this model that seems like pretty good. And since then, they cross-validated it in like 21 international cohorts. Has become very well accepted within the nephrology community. But the idea was to bring this to primary care. So just kind of summarizing everything I talked about so far, CKD is prevalent, mostly managed in primary care clinics. We talked a little bit about the monitoring, the treatment, referral, and the gaps in care. And then this idea that uncertainty about the risk of progression is what contributes to delays. And so then the idea was like, so can we just take the data in the EHR and give clinical decision support to the PCPs, help them risk stratify the patients, and would that lead to improved outcomes? And so this is kind of just breaking it down. Like we have the existing laboratory tests, we can prompt people to order missing tests, calculate the risk model, Tangri is the name of it, present the risk assessment to PCPs, and then for people at high risk, suggest referrals to nephrologists. And sort of like a little bit more detail, we ended up, specific aim one was developing the CDS, and specific aim two was testing it in a randomized clinical trial. We ended up, I'll talk a little bit more about this, using the web browser-based application with the CCDA to extract the data and calculate the risk. And then we did a little bit of usability and user requirements, but it ended up being kind of a small piece. I had some time pressure because the day I found out that I got the care word was the same week that we said we're going to Epic. So it's kind of rushing to get into the main part of the study. Luckily, it rolled out to parts of our organization before others. So my hospital and practices went to Epic, but then the North Shore Physicians Group was still using our legacy homegrown EHR called Longitudinal Medical Record, or LMR, and that's actually where we did the study. So this was the piece that I was just going to mention a little bit because I know there's so many people here that are experts in this area. Implementation of a scalable web-based automated CDS risk prediction tool for CKD using CCDA and API. So just a conversation at a conference led to me and John Demore working together on this. He was just spinning up a company that was going to try to take the CCDAs and give back analytics to hospitals. And I was talking about the risk prediction model and saying that, it would be really cool if we could do this as a standalone application and not have to do it as part of Epic. And he said, oh, demographics and labs, that's like the most standardized, LOINC, right? It came from here. So he was like, I could do that. So we just worked together and it was a great project. I learned a lot. And this was the publication that came out of just the development piece. This is what it looked like to the end user. So basically at the very top, there's just our logo and the name of the tool. There are different tabs. So you could actually manually paste in the CCD if you just had it as a text form. We set it up to do it automatically. And then this page would give you all this information about what stage the patient's in of both using the blood test, that's the stage 3, 4, 5, as well as they stage the albuminuria as well. So this patient has kind of moderately increased albuminuria. And then the little box would have different colors for if missing tests. If it's missing tests, they're yellow. If it was risk over 10%, it would be red, recommending referral to nephrologist. And then you can see all of the data that was extracted from the CCD, and you can actually change it and recalculate it. So if you thought something like the UACR can be falsely elevated in certain situations, so you could type in a new value and recalculate it. And then at the bottom of the screen, there's all information about which test result, the date, timestamp, and everything. So we did a couple of different tests, validation steps here. So first, there were these, this is such early days now. So all the EHR companies had example CCDs in a repository. So first we fed those in. This is kind of cheating because basically John went in and added the serum creatinine values and things because they didn't have any of those lab results. But so we went ahead and loaded those in from different vendor products and our own and made sure it was working. When patients were missing tests, we calculated a range of risk, which is why you see like these ranges. So that all worked. And then we were able to work with the our colleagues in the IS department partners, and we gave them like 5 scenarios, just wrote out like a Word document of like a patient's this old, and they have these characteristics, these values. So they loaded all of that in to our system as test patients, and we were able to do the same thing, produce a CCD, load it through, make sure that it worked. And some of the, this is some more of the details of like which elements we extracted. One kind of interesting thing, which I thought was like so funny, was that, when we first did this, we were using a different value. So the bottom one here, bicarbonate. So we were using a different thing that was called serum bicarbonate. And I come to find out that my entire life, the thing that I called serum bicarbonate is not actually serum bicarbonate. So we just all used the wrong term. And so when we did this, they all had missing values. And we're like, wait a second, this makes no sense. So, we could see it in the chart, but we could see it in the base of my ball panel on the chart, but like it wasn't extracting it. And then we discovered that the one that we actually wanted was total CO2 in serum. And we used this listing of like how common each of the link codes were to figure it out. But I just couldn't believe it. Like my whole life, we were calling it the wrong thing. So these are the kind of funny things that you discover. Then we were able to work with some colleagues again in the IS department, and they were the people in charge of the CCD factory. So they were in charge of, making sure that we were going to be in compliance with meaningful use and other things, and that we'd be able to produce these CCDs. And so we were able to give them a list of 100 patients under an IRB. And they just literally had to press a button for each of the 100 patients to produce the CCD, and we loaded them in manually and processed them. And so, as you can see, I think this will not be surprising considering what I'd shown you before, but like the urine ACR, not there very often. And also serum phosphorus, also missing a lot of the time, not something top of mind for PCPs, top of mind for nephrologists. That was one of the big things that we found that was different. You'll also see in column 4 here that when the UACR is normal, it's below assay. It's a text result. So we did learn quite a bit from this step, and I don't have all the results here, but we basically had to we had to deal with the text string, and we kind of went into it knowing that there was going to be a lot of patients that had these ranges displayed, and that we'd be recommending ordering the missing tests. We implemented this following the example of my colleague Li Zhou. I'd worked a little bit on this project with her before I got the K award. This is some of her early NLP work with her M-term system, but basically the little picture is just showing like the user is sitting in front of the LMR web application, and what they're doing is calling a web page from Li's server, but Li's server is calling all of these services that we had available to us through Partners Health System IS, and they're just being presented the web page. That's exactly what we did. So like that little cartoon is just supposed to show person's looking at the browser and they're calling our web page from a different server. And this is how the link appeared. Like this is what LMR looked like. And this area here was where all the preventive health recommendations would come up. We couldn't embed everything there because it had like very clunky logic. So we just were able to put it above. And if you hovered over it, it would give you like a little bit more information about what it was saying. And then you could click on it and go to our web page. So the results. So we didn't determine one thing from user testing that I have a quote about it later, but basically people sometimes look at the chart and there's a chance a patient might get labs done right before the appointment. And so we actually process for each patient everything 3 days before the appointment and then 1 day before. So that totaled 500,000 documents being processed. About 7% of the patients had stage 4 or 5 CKD, 6,000 patients, and the PCP, so we actually randomized patients in the study. So all of the PCPs ended up, 145 PCPs ended up seeing the link on the intervention patients. And there's a little bit of demographic information there at the bottom. So this was the paper, which it took us forever to publish. The bottom line is that the link was only clicked 122 times by 57 PCPs, and there was no association with the primary outcome, didn't work. And there was actually a higher level of nephrology referral in the control arm than the intervention arm. So this didn't work. And this is everyone that helped me with it. So what do you do when your thing doesn't work? Well, try to go back and understand why it didn't work. So, you guys are like implementation science experts. I was just kind of like fumbling my way through, like, what do I do now? Let me just talk to people. So, actually this is part of some of the stuff we did towards the beginning, this user requirements analysis we were doing sort of in parallel when we were actually finishing up the design. So, some of these things came into play, but there's a lot that we didn't have time to really address in I learned a lot from that. So one of the things that was really key, and this is where the thinking for the R1 project came, that, as a PCP, they're not jumping to like refer the patient. They're thinking, oh my gosh, this patient's risk seems high. It's red, it's high. What is wrong? Like, is it their blood pressure control? Is it their diabetes? I need to make sure all of those risk factors are controlled. So that was super interesting and a useful reminder. And kind of going with what I was saying before about PCPs are like, but why would I refer them to nephrology? Like, I can handle all this stuff. Other kind of key insights. So everyone's very used to very poorly designed or inaccurate CDS. So people, like when we showed them what it would look like, they're just like, well, it's probably just acute kidney failure. Like I would just completely ignore that. I don't want things popping up because it's probably wrong. The second line is about integrations workflow. So, the top quote is basically saying that people would spend like a lot of time looking at the patient's chart before the patient's even there, which is why we were trying to have this appear in the chart a couple days before. And then the other piece, which we didn't address, was that if people looked at this and said, oh, something's missing, or I think that is falsely elevated, then they would be ordering more labs, but then they no longer have the CDS in front of them when they're getting the labs back. So that's like, this totally doesn't fit in the workflow when they're actually making decisions. They might forget that that's why they ordered it. Even if they are thinking that they might talk to the patient, they don't have a lot of time, they might just call them on the phone. So there's a lot of barriers to referral that we weren't addressing with this approach. So the rationale for the R1 study started there. Basically, I want to focus back on the idea of helping the PCPs to manage the CKD. There's been a lot of focus on diabetes, of course, like rightly so, and there's quality metrics around measuring the urine protein level of diabetes. That's been great. That's done a lot. So hypertension's been less of a focus, and there have been a number of really great CDS studies in non-CKD hypertension populations, including within the VA. But there have been a couple of attempts recent to when I was writing this, but they hadn't worked. And so that's why I decided to make that the focus. So with this study, we decided to have mean systolic blood pressure 6 months after the CDS fired as the outcome. And we used kind of similar methods. This was an EPIC now. Similar methods to bring together existing EHR data to show that the patient has CKD via lab values only, not the problem list, and also that they had multiple elevated blood pressures. We did more of the human factors work early on and really followed that more in designing the CDS. And then we also incorporated some behavioral economic principles, including nudges. And so, this is a lot of detail about it, but I think the key things there, I think I already said it, AIM-1A was existing lab tests, med orders, vital sign data. We are telling the PCP, the patient has CKD. We're telling them the blood pressures have been multiple elevated blood pressures, and then we're telling them what to do about it. And then in AIM-1B, we talked about increasing informativeness in different ways of the alert with a Think Loud study. And then AIM-1C was kind of a couple of different elements of behavioral economic nudges. So the orders were pre-checked, default orders. We decided not to do an in-person conference in the end, actually, because some of my colleagues thought it was better to do a much lower touch thing that would be easier to disseminate. So we did this email where we sent control arm PCPs an email just saying CKD guidelines here, and then intervention. It was, hey, we're going to give you some advice about CKD. Will you pledge to either follow the advice or let us know why you didn't follow it? And that's the required accountable justification under the very last thing under number 3 there. And then AIM-2 is just testing it. I'll tell you more details about the Pragmatic clinical trial as we go. This is boring to read all this text, I know. So just to kind of give you a high level, we'd said in the grant that we were just going to do one CDS alert. I'm calling them BPAs because it's the EPIC phraseology, best practice advisory. And that was going to be patients with CKD, uncontrolled blood pressure who are not on an ACE to start an ACE. But actually, we had that before an LMR. So then the idea was, okay, can we go farther? So AIM-1B would be patients with documented ACE allergy, recommended an ARB. And then 2A and 2B would be kind of stepwise intensification for ACE and ARB, respectively. And then 3A would be if they were maxed out, we wanted to give them one more recommendation, and we ended up settling with HCTZ, partly just because people are familiar with it, and we only did in stage 3. So anyway, we had a lot of conversations with the clinical people on the team, what's one more thing we could do for uncontrolled blood pressure. This is way too small to see. Just kind of some details about the usability testing. I'll go to it in a different slide here. Yeah, here we go. So usability testing, not a ton of people involved, but I still feel like this is a pretty good We had a lot of really useful information out of this. It was also during COVID. So we're very lucky because people were actually free. And so we actually got tons of PCPs like signing up to do this stuff because they were just like at home. So that worked out very well for us. Usually very hard to get PCPs to do things like this. So we had these contextual inquiry sessions where we start very broadly, like how do you think about CKD? What do you look at? What information do you look for? Trying to just understand their thought process. Then we had some, we mocked up some different options and had focus groups. And then we had these one-on-one sessions that were really cool where over Zoom, we could like hand over control of the keyboard and they could actually like open up a test version of Epic and see the alert pop up and then give us their thoughts. And then also got feedback from the leadership in order to get, kind of get everyone to buy in. So some of the examples of things that we found out, I know you guys have like a huge group that does this type of work. So, this was kind of, I don't know if this is like kind of similar to other stuff I was saying, but, one of the things was just that getting multiple alerts or multiple pieces of information disjointed was not helpful. And so we, and also people wanted to be actionable. So that's where we got the idea of doing the pre-populated order buttons, which look like that. So basically like if the accept button was down here, if you clicked accept, you were actually ordering losartan 50 in a basic metabolic panel, like just one click. We also realized that people wanted more information that we didn't initially think of including. We want to make it really informative. So someone wanted to know what the potassium level was. Somebody wanted to know what the most recent EGFR was. Maybe even though they had 2 depressed ones in the past, maybe now it's improved. And so we were able to add those things to the display and add, and you can kind of see like the iterations of changing the details. Lots of reasons why people said they wouldn't follow the recommendations. We wanted to try to capture those in those acknowledged reasons so we could learn. And so we added in a bunch of different things, including like, we'll discuss with the patient, we'll review chart. I mean, one of the problems was that what we discovered from talking to people about their workflow is that the open chart, like the point in time the person opens the chart, was the most similar across different people's workflows. So like if we tried to put this later in the workflow, people might not see it in the room because they may have already let the patient go by the time they're like signing orders or closing the chart. So that's like, it was good that we learned that, but it's also not ideal because basically the person's just sitting down and then they're talking to the patient, they're like trying to open their chart and this thing's like popping up. Well, so definitely not ideal place in the workflow. And this is part of why we added these acknowledged reasons, but it did come up as one of the like key things that was like not ideal. You can see that there. So this is the end result. So basically a header that just says very simply, patient has CKD, 2 SVPs over 140, not on ACE or ARB. And then this section called why did this alert fire walks through the lab values that show that the patient has CKD, says that there's been the 2 ambulatory SVPs over 140 with today's SVP, and that they're not on ACE or ARB. They're most using potassium. Very brief information about the guidelines with a link. The order buttons are populated to order, except for this option to order a renal e-consult, and the acknowledged reasons at the bottom. So this is the paper that summarized our work like with the users. And this is the 5 different BPAs. And we kind of grouped in these categories. So like category 1 was initiating either ACE or ARB. Category 2 was escalating. And category 3 was if they're maxed out to offer hydrochlorothiazide as an option. As we were doing this, we were just trying to do a lot of data validation. And anyone that's done this, whatever system you're in, there's all these surprises. So basically what we determined was that the way the clinics were coded in Epic made no sense. Like they're called departments, and then sometimes like one physical location would have like 2 departments, or it just didn't match like the names or anything. So we actually ended up having to like go to the administrative side of our primary care network and say, give us a name, like give us all the names of the doctors. Then we're going to figure out what the departments are from that. So we had to do a lot of things like that. And just going through all these steps with every single lab value, every single medication code, we developed a really nice way of looking back at retrospective data and validating it. So what we ended up doing, and this wasn't in the grant, but it was a thing that I felt like we should do, was we spent an entire year figuring all this stuff out. So we knew that we were putting accurate information into the CDS. And then we were actually able to so basically I'll walk you through this. So we basically went back and said, okay, over a year's time, and we just have like dates like pre-COVID, how many people saw a primary care doctor based on like ones that we actually know were primary care doctors. And then, okay, rule out anyone who doesn't have CAD, rule out people who have stage 5 CKD, rule out people whose blood pressure is under control, rule out people who have ACE or ARB on the med list, rule out people who are allergic to both ACE or ARB according to the allergy list, rule out people who have hyperkalemia. Okay, so now we have these people that fit into our 1A and 1B categories. We also pulled out women of childbearing age, which we put a pregnancy warning for those patients. So we were able to project, to estimate how often this would fire. And we were doing it sort of as part of our just trying to make sure we were being accurate with the data, but it was actually pretty helpful then in talking to primary care leadership or others to say, there's not going to be that many alerts that fire overall. I wanted to know that for myself. Is this going to be firing all the time, annoying the PCP? But it's actually not, because each individual PCP has a very small number of patients that fit these criteria. And so we were able to kind of show, the numbers there, the very highest number is 60, and that's a weekly rate spread out over 180 PCPs. So we knew this would be not firing that often for each individual PCP. So then we went from that stage into starting to build out the test versions of it. So we built them in this INV environment that we had, and that's actually what we used for those tests, those usability sessions I was talking about. Then we had to work with the operational folks to move it then into the POC environment, and I think that was pretty simple. We had test patients that we created that had all the correct lab values and blood pressures and everything. We found a couple little problems there. Then what was interesting is we just decided, okay, we'll move it into the SUP environment, which has real patient data. And the reason I wanted to do that is even with our test patients being very complex and having all the information we expected to be there, I knew that there could be things that would come up, but I didn't really think it was going to be that big a deal. Turned out, I'll show you in the next slide, we did find some really pretty big problems in that environment, and that slowed things down a bit. And a bunch of people had to help us because none of us researchers had access to that environment, so we had to figure out we had to do a lot of detective work to figure out what was wrong. Then we went into production and did everything in silent mode for intervention and control. And it's pretty easy to clone BPAs. So that was not a big ask of Dan, who was the person who's helping us. So we just put it into production and had it fire in silent mode. And we just reviewed every single chart that was firing on. And then when it was time, and actually I think me and my mentor, David Bates, and a couple people were and when we just, one of our nephrology colleagues were let's just turn it on for ourselves. So we had it turned on for ourselves, and then retired all of those, and for the actual trial, we cloned them all, and we had silent ones for the control arm PCPs, and then ones that actually fired for the intervention PCPs. So the thing that came up during sub-testing, which I thought was so funny and fascinating, I thought you guys might find interesting as well, is that we realized that patients that were on ARBs were having it fire as if they were not on an ACE or ARB, so they were getting the 1A. And we were what is going on? We can see it on the list. So we determined that finally, after looking at the charts a bunch, and all my RAs were trying to figure this out, basically, even though we'd had Epic for 5 years at this point, these ARB prescriptions were still not in structured fields. They were basically free text prescriptions. And I was shocked because as a PCP during that first few years after Epic, every time that happens, when you go to sign it, it tries to force you to put it into you have to prove it's going into a structured field version of the prescription. If you're just looking at the med list, it actually looks the same. So it's kind of difficult to tell, but I couldn't believe it. And I actually think it's the cardiologist, that patients that were started this by cardiologists, it seemed like they were just getting refilled as free text. So we actually just had to exclude those patients. Allison McCoy came up with a really clever rule that basically said if the dose is 0, then just exclude the patient. So we were able to overcome it. We definitely let our friends know that work on the safety side of things, that these prescriptions weren't even being recognized by the system. All right, so then we ran a pilot for a few weeks. During the pilot, we basically just reached out to every single PCP that saw the alert, just try to make sure everything was working, get their feedback. Started the trial February 26, 2021, ran it for a full year. And then we had this data collection period of 6 months for each individual patient, but we also gave a 60-day buffer period so the people that didn't come right in the 6-month mark would still be able to have a chance to have their data collected. So we didn't actually end the data collection for 8 more months after that. Here's just a histogram of all the firings overall, intervention and control by month. I mean, we did not realize that there would be these seasonal trends, but we luckily we were doing it for a whole year. Most were BPA 1A followed by BPA 1B. This is kind of what we expected from the work we'd done with retrospective data. And this is what people said as their reason for not following the advice. So we'll repeat BP, we'll discuss with patient, we'll review chart, remind me next visit, and then we'll order a different dose, and then free text, other free text. One of the things I wanted to touch on, which, I don't think is very common in clinical decision support studies, and I think it should be more common, especially for a study like this where it's pretty aggressive. Like if someone just hits accept, they're ordering a medication that has side effects that can cause other problems. So when we wrote the grant, we kind of wrote sort of a typical data safety monitoring board plan. We're going to have a data safety monitoring board, and we're going to, we'll do chart reviews for any patient whose SVP drops below 110, any deaths, and any reported adverse events, which are very uncommon. We had none. And then, as the study was so first of all, just one kind of interesting thing that probably won't be surprising to clinicians in the room is, these are patients who are in their 70s. And even though they all had multiple SVPs over 140, 20% of them also had SVPs over 110. And we didn't stop following them. So from day one of the trial until end of month 8 post-trial, we kept following every single patient for SVPs less than 110. And during that period of time, 20% of them did. So, it just goes to show, just like I was talking about all the reasons that PCPs didn't want to refer the patient to nephrology, and they're very reasonable, it's reasonable to be concerned. These patients have labile blood pressure. So that was a little surprising to me, but we found out about that. We did do a very thorough chart review on participant deaths, which just, was the same in both arms, 5 in each arm, looking for falls, looking for any evidence that, that the blood pressure, what we recommended could have in some way caused harm, and no reported adverse events. While the trial was happening and we were really at the beginning looking at every single chart, discussing it, we started to think about, even though we didn't say we'd do this for the grant, it wouldn't be too hard for us to do an automated report that would also pull up all of these types of potential adverse clinical outcomes. So, lab values, pretty easy to just automatically pull, and then also newly documented allergies, because we're thinking, okay, if somebody prescribes the medication we recommend and then the patient has a reaction, we can pull that. So we just, during when the trial was going on, it's so different from a regular trial because we actually kind of had nothing to do. We just wait for a year and it's just firing. So the team was doing chart reviews and we learned quite a bit. These are the numbers for each of those outcomes. And, we did a pretty thorough chart review, but in a very, looking back, it would have been great if we'd done it a little more structured way. We just did it sort of people just doing it in a Word document, writing down some key information. But I did want to publish this, and I was having a lot of trouble figuring out where it could go. I just wanted it to be a brief report, we decided to do this because we thought there could be unintended consequences, and here's what we found. We did actually just get this accepted to JGEM, I'm happy to say. And then another thing, and this is very busy, but it's just kind of showing the primary outcomes at the top, and the orange bubble is patients' baseline characteristics, and this side is all the different outcomes that we didn't actually end up even doing all of them. We didn't do hospital admissions and ED visits in the end. But one of the things that we just done the revisions on a paper that took us a really long time was we wanted to try to parse out exactly what people hit, what buttons they hit, and then whether or not they signed the order after it went into the little pending place in Epic. And that was very difficult. But after a lot of work between my data analysts and Allison McCoy and a lot of other people, we figured out how all of those little details. And so we've kind of laid that out. And it's pretty interesting. People X'd out of the order a lot. Sometimes they then went back and ordered the med later in the encounter or a later encounter. People hit remind me next visit 10% of the time. We looked at all the free text comments. So yeah, definitely it's good to collect all that information. Not always easy to get it out, but you can get it out. This was the final paper I just mentioned, was published. This is some more of the details of the trial. So basically, we started out with a list from the administration about who was a PCP provider in our system, 220 people. We did a lot of work. I don't want any residents or fellows. I don't know. I just try to never include residents or fellows because I feel like they do practice differently than people who have been in practice a while. We also didn't want urgent care providers. We didn't think this was as appropriate for them. So we tried to figure that out from their templates. And then we also just emailed people to find out if we weren't sure. We invited 184 PCPs. There was a pilot, or it's not even a pilot, it's going on now for real, where there's one practice that has advanced practice providers, including NPs and PAs, co-managing with PCPs. And so we decided to keep those people in, but we made the system look at them as one person. So it wasn't exactly perfect, but that's how we dealt with that. They had a shared panel. And then we gave PCPs the option to opt out. Nobody did. We randomized the PCPs, and the bottom of the number of total patients. So 1,029 intervention, 997 control. So this is the top level result. So the primary outcome was change in SBP from baseline to 6 months. and there was a larger change in the intervention arm. And then a secondary outcome was blood pressure control, which at baseline was 0% in both arms, and ended up being very similarly about 50% in both arms at the end. Also, as I was saying, it was kind of difficult we wanted to include the actual buttons push and all that in the main paper, a little bit difficult to figure that out. So we went ahead and just said, in both arms, all ACE, ARB, hydrochlorothiazide orders, as well as basic metabolic panel orders and nephrology e-consult orders. And so that's what the top row is, comparing intervention to control. And there was a significant difference between the arms. And then just looking at those 3 medication classes, there's still about a 15% difference in prescription rate. And this was like, we put all this in the supplement to the paper as sort of like a supporting piece of information to the primary outcome. So things that we learned, the cluster randomization at the PCP level worked well. Nudges were actually, they're fairly acceptable. I mean, we didn't really have people saying, oh my gosh, this is so dangerous, turn this off. We knew that the open chart trigger action was not great. I had my absolute favorite PCP that works right next to me in my clinic came to me and was like, turn this thing off. And I was like, okay. So that made me sad. He's actually a cardiologist by training. But he agreed to have his data be used until the end of the study. And so it was an intention to treat analysis. So he was still in the intervention arm. And then there's 2 other PCPs that are also very close friends of mine who got in touch with me and brought up all of their frustrations specifically about it popping up. And we talked about it and I explained like why and everything. And they actually, agreed to stay in the study. But I just bring this up because if 3 people that I know really well complained to me, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. Probably like everybody hated it and they just didn't feel comfortable talking to me. So I thought that was an important lesson. And I was just talking about, like, I don't have any formal implementation science training. I know you have a lot of people here that are implementation science experts. And these are the types of things that, this is a little bit of anecdotal information, but like done more rigorously, I think that this could help us to one of the solutions would be there should be different types of trigger actions. There are not very many options of where to fire the CDS in the EPIC ambulatory encounter. Great, and that's the acknowledgements, and I'm supposed to take you to, wait, where is the CME thing? Sorry, I'm trying to take you there. But I'm ready to take questions now. This is the extra slides. Oops, there it goes. Okay, and I'm ready to take questions now. We have 15 minutes. So just to get a show of hands, how many of you work on clinical decision support for your research? CDS folks, yeah. What about other types of health services research, which there's a little bit there? Great, yes, very important. How about, any other CKD people? I know I've got one here. How about diabetes? Yay, hypertension? Yay, good, okay. Just wanted to see.
We also have a bunch of people online. So,
oh yeah, that's right. Okay, I don't know how.
Yeah. So one question, just to kick off discussion, would be, given sort of the reaction to these BPAs that you introduced, how do you think that bodes for AI now coming into medicine and presumably triggering and controlling in the future the CDS that pops up for ambulatory clinicians? What do you think the reaction, is that something you guys are thinking about at Brigham, and how are you approaching that, or other CDS studies given what you found?
Yeah, no one in my small DGIM group is doing AI-enabled CDS. There have been, I was part of one evaluation by one of the emergency medicine physicians who's like the head of CDS for the entire corporation organization, MGB, Mass General Brigham called now, just trying to do an external validation of the AKI prediction tool. And there's also a sepsis risk prediction tool that Karandeep Singh did a really great evaluation at Michigan, multi-site. So I mean, there's been people trying to just externally validate the stuff that comes out of the box in EPIC. So I think the key thing is, we added all that information. We try to add as much information to the alert that would be useful without overwhelming the physician, because we heard is people are like, we want to know why it's firing. We don't trust it. Tell us why it's firing. So if you're going to fire something that's using AI and you're not going to be able to explain why it's firing, that's not going to go well. It's basically like, I just think that's like intuitive. It's not going to go well. I had a medical student that I worked with on a project that was so great. She was very just interested in the whole idea of doctors not being very comfortable with AI. And then we narrowed it down into sepsis, risk prediction tools, AI versus, role-based. And then she interviewed a bunch of hospital leaders that had implemented different types of sepsis risk prediction tools. And yeah, we got some great quotes from that, like in ways that different organizations handled very high false positive rates. Like one place had an entire team of nurses and even like a physician sitting in a different room, fielding the alerts and deciding if it was worth bothering the clinical team. It's like, that seems like very time intensive, but that's what they felt like they needed to do because there was so much false positives, so, and the clinicians weren't going to put up with it. Other people were like trying to make analogies, like it's like a weather prediction, or I don't know. I mean, some of them felt like they weren't even really the accurate analogies. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting area that there needs to be a lot more work done to understand how the user is going to take that information and actually use it. I mean, you're telling someone who's been practicing medicine for 20 to 30 years that this patient over here that you're not paying attention to is going to crump. Like that, they're not going to listen. Why would they listen to you? That's going against everything they've learned. So that's my thought so far. But I'm trying to be, I'm trying to think through like how will we help people to become more used to it as it becomes better and more useful.
Great presentation. So my question is, you learned a lot of lessons, especially related to clinicians' perspectives about using decision support. So how did you address them? I'm assuming, are they still using this decision support system? And what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, when I didn't even really think through, basically what we said when we asked for permission to do it was like, we're going to do it for a year, then we're going to turn it off and then see if it worked, which is going to take a long time. And I'm actually now in my new position going to be involved in conversations about, okay, what does the governance process look like when something appears to have been successful in a study? And how are we going to take research BPAs operational? And then there's all the issues that come up around knowledge management, all these data fields. Like we did so much work to validate every single data field. I would not feel comfortable turning it back on without doing that again, because things change, codes are merged, new meds come on. There was a human error I didn't put in there where somebody had altered something that I don't even understand what this is, but like a preference list somehow controls, I didn't even know this, but somehow the way the med orders are shown, it's something called a preference list, and someone had accidentally put steroids and oral contraceptive pills into the preference list. And the way we found out was that a PCP typed in, why is this patient being recommended steroids? And then that like flagged to my colleagues who worked, like look at all the feedback, and they were like, wait a second, what's going on? And then they discovered this had happened. So human error. So yeah, I think that this is a really interesting question, and how to get to a learning health system, right? I think that we still are a long way from that, but hopefully we'll be working toward that.
Lipika, the path you took in this series of studies is actually pretty typical. You anticipate it's going to be this path this way, and it's really bounces all over the place because of changing in health systems, changing of the information infrastructure, changing of what's happening, other people are doing out in the literature. It's all dynamic at the same time. And you're trying to do this in real world environments and that where people are practicing and they, et cetera. What advice would you give, and do you give, because you're a fellowship director, do you give junior faculty as they're embarking on a career like this, to set their expectations so that they can progress and not have unreasonable expectations about how things are going to go?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's such a good question. I mean, I think one of the, so first of all, I was in a 3-year fellowship, and it's very hard in a shorter fellowship to really see the fruits of your labors. It takes a long time. I mean, I'm sure most of you have published papers, so it's like to actually go from inception to getting the paper published takes a long time. Like that medical student I was talking about ended up publishing in JAMIA Open, I think in her 3rd year of residency. So it was like 4 or 5 years. But she is doing a combined CI and Duke and cardiology fellowship at Duke now, so I'm very happy about that. But it takes a very long time when you have clinical responsibilities, when you have other responsibilities. So, it is important to have, it takes time to learn how to do this too, but to have a portfolio of things that are like quick wins and then like things that could take longer. If you're thinking about applying for grants, you really do need to be thinking about the preliminary data that's going to go into the grant proposal. So if, I was talking to Josh about how I never thought I was going to do chronic kidney disease. It was really just something that I want to do multiple chronic conditions, and I want to do things with like patient, provider, and system level intervention. I just wasn't getting anywhere with my K-word applications there. So that's how I settled on that. So I started doing a suite of projects looking at the data about chronic kidney disease, but I was also working on other things. Like you can do that. It's just you have to balance. You have to balance everything. And then I would say, just on a more optimistic note, things changed for the better too. I was just complaining last night how my first paper was rejected from JAMIA because it was too public health. And go submit this to Public Health Journal. We don't care about this topic, and that was like very frustrating to me. But things have changed, like AMI has changed, and a lot of like the study section structure of NIH has changed. So I think you can see good changes too.
And maybe this, you were sort of alluding to this in the sort of the pending paper about like, who was clicking what and how many times. Could you say more about the individuals who were sort of like opting out within the trial? Kind of like, what was their ultimate behavior? Because it's sort of interesting, like, like saying like, let me look at the chart, sort of like, hold up, this is in my face, I need a break. Or for my interest, also like, let me talk to the patient,
right.
Is like a really interesting sort of thing to say, and then to know what ultimately happens, or kind of what goes on between those two endpoints.
Yeah, and see, this is a great example of like just kind of even connecting it to the other questions. Like, I only did one formal analysis like that, and it was because the pre-med student who is now applying to residency, I can't believe it, he was, Michael's his name, he was very interested in that question, and so he just decided, like, he wanted to write something for an SGIM abstract, and I was like, okay, well, like, let's see if people are actually doing what they're saying they're doing, like in the trial. And so he reviewed 100 charts where they said, we'll repeat blood pressure, and about 2/3 of the time they repeated the blood pressure. But see, that's the type of thing where, like, there's so many questions like that we just haven't had time to go and answer. We definitely looked into, like in this paper, we found 8 cases, and we were looking really hard to try to figure out if anyone accidentally ordered the med. And there were 8 different times where someone indicated the med was then later discontinued. And I think they wrote error I can't remember exactly. I think there's like a pre-filled thing that you can click error. And so we like looked really deeply into those charts. And in 4 of the cases, we felt like there was documentation that showed that they did actually accidentally order the med. So that was the thing I was most concerned about. And it did happen, 4 times out of like 1,000 patients. And you have to ask yourself, like, okay, is that okay or not? I mean, like, what are we comparing? Because there's not much stuff in the CDS literature. So like, are we comparing ourselves to clinical trials? Like, what's our benchmark for what is acceptable? But yeah, so I mean, I wish we had more time, because there's so, I mean, if anyone wants to work on it, the data's all there. Like, I just don't have time. I don't know if any of the CDS people have tried to get into these tables in Epic and Clarity, but like the ALT table I thought was going to be pretty simple. Like, it's just the alert table. There's going to be all the information, but they actually have built in some things there that make it hard to parse out. Like, basically, if someone orders something that was recommended in the alert in the encounter, it puts it into that table, because whoever set up the table thought, oh, they just want to know if it got ordered eventually. And it was very hard to like tease out which were ordered from the alert, like within the alert versus outside of the alert. But those, I think, are the types of data that should be available if you're looking at higher risk interventions.
All right, well, I checked, there's no questions online, so it doesn't look like there's a long line here at the microphone. So, but thank you very much. Please join me in, again, thanking Dr. Samal for her visit and lecture today.
Thank you. Thank you.